Back in the winter of 1957, I was 17 days into what was supposed to be a 5-day expedition across the northern reaches of British Columbia. My thermal gear, all of it, had been destroyed when I fell through thin ice trying to cross a frozen river. Everything was soaked. Everything. The temperature that night dropped to 42 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. My sleeping bag was useless. My tent was useless. My modern emergency kit, which I'd spent good money on back in the settlement, was frozen solid and might as well have been a brick. I had maybe 6 hours before hypothermia would start winning, and I was alone, completely alone. No radio, no backup, no rescue team that knew where I was because I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was going. I had nothing but the clothes I was wearing, a metal pot, a knife with a 7-inch blade, and the knowledge that almost every trapper I'd ever met would have been dead within 2 hours in those conditions. But I made it through that night, and the next 16 nights after it. And I want to tell you exactly how I did it, because what I discovered that winter changed everything about how I approached fire in extreme cold. It wasn't the primitive method. It was the only method that actually worked when everything else failed. I was born in 1934, which means I came of age right when the Great Depression was ending and the Second World War was just beginning. My father was a logger up in the Canadian North, and by the time I was 12 years old, I'd already spent more time in the bush than most people spend in cities in a lifetime. The standard method that everyone used back then, the method that every experienced trapper, every guide, every wilderness veteran insisted was the only way, was the council fire. You know the one. A large fire, 3 to 4 feet in diameter typically, burning hot and bright, meant to push heat outward in all directions. The theory was simple. More fire meant more heat, more visibility, more security. I'd built literally hundreds of council fires by the time I was 20. I'd watched my mentor, old Charlie McTavish, build them in conditions I thought were impossible. -30, -35 degrees. Charlie would have a roaring council fire going in under 15 minutes. The man was legendary for it. But here's what I discovered, and what almost killed me before I understood it. A council fire in extreme cold isn't fighting the cold. It's fighting heat loss. And when the temperature gets down to -40 or below, that fire is losing heat faster than it's generating it in a way that helps you survive. When I fell through that ice in 1957, I was still doing what every trapper did. I was trying to build the biggest fire I could with the materials I had. Spruce wood, which I found standing dead about 200 yards from where I fell. The wood was brittle, but it was dry inside, and I managed to get 3 armfuls of it. I built what I thought was going to be my salvation, a council fire, about 4 feet across. And here's where I made the mistake. I made it in an open area. No windbreak, no reflection, just me, my fire, and about 70 miles of open snow between me and the nearest tree line. The fire burned hot. Maybe I got it up to 1,500 degrees at the center, but the wind was moving at around 20 miles per hour that night. The cold was moving through the flames like water through a sieve, and my body temperature started dropping anyway. I remember thinking at around midnight that I'd made a catastrophic error, that I was going to die out there like an idiot, having done everything right according to every principle I'd been taught. If you like this kind of practical knowledge that can save your life, subscribe to the channel. I post a new survival technique every week, all tested by me during 40 years in the wilderness. Every single method I share has been verified through real experience, not theory, not YouTube videos made by people who've never spent a winter in the true north. All right, now let's get to what matters. The knowledge that saved me that night came from 2 completely different sources. The first was a man named Thomas Bearspaw, a Cree elder who lived about 60 miles from where I eventually settled. Thomas was probably 85 years old when I met him. He'd spent his entire life, every single winter, in that country. He'd never owned a sleeping bag, never owned a tent. When I asked him one day how he survived, he told me something that contradicted everything I'd been taught. He said, "The fire doesn't warm you. Your body warms you. The fire just has to not steal the heat that your body makes. That was a complete reversal of how I understood fire. The second source was something I observed myself, almost by accident. A scientist from the University of Alberta came through our camp one winter in 1956, studying animal behavior in extreme cold. He had instruments, thermometers. He showed me that my council fires were warming the air immediately around them to maybe 80 or 90 degrees Fahrenheit, but that warmth was dissipating at about 100 feet away. And by the time it reached where I was sitting, it was maybe 5 to 10 degrees warmer than the ambient temperature. That seemed better than nothing, but the effort required to maintain that fire, constantly gathering wood, constantly feeding it, was burning more calories than the heat it generated was saving. I was losing. The fire was winning. Thomas said something to me one evening that year. He said, "You build big fires because you're afraid. When you stop being afraid, you build fires that work." I asked him what he meant, and he said, "You come back next winter and I'll show you." I did go back, and he did show me. The materials for what I learned aren't exotic. They aren't difficult to find, but they have to be exactly right, or the whole system fails. The first material is wood, specifically dead standing wood, preferably from conifers like spruce, fir, or pine. The reason is density. Hardwoods like birch or aspen have higher moisture content even when they're dead, and they're denser, which means they burn slower and cooler. A dead spruce tree that's been standing for 1 to 3 years, that's your target. The wood should break cleanly when you bend a branch. If it flexes, it's too fresh. If it crumbles into powder, it's too old and has absorbed moisture again. You want that range. You need to collect pieces in multiple sizes. I typically gather pieces that range from pencil thin to about 2 inches in diameter. The thin pieces are for kindling. The medium pieces are for sustaining the initial flame. The thicker pieces are for the main fire, but here's the crucial part. You don't want any piece larger than 2 inches in diameter for this particular method. That's a hard rule. Anything thicker than 2 inches and the fire becomes inefficient in extreme cold. The second material is birch bark. Birch bark from a tree that's been dead for at least 2 years is ideal. It separates in thin, papery layers, and when you peel it correctly, each layer is almost pure cellulose and oils. I gather enough to fill roughly 1 gallon in volume, compressed, not loose. That sounds like a lot, but it burns hot and fast, and you'll need it. The third material is stones, specifically stones that haven't been near water in decades. River stones will shatter violently when heated because trapped moisture inside them turns to steam and explodes. You want stones from high ground, typically from rocky outcrops or old glacial deposits. You're looking for stones that are roughly the size of your fist to the size of your head. I typically collect 15 to 20 of them before I start, and I've arranged them in a circle about 2 feet in diameter before I even light the first piece of kindling. The fourth material is insulation for underneath you. This is critical. You lose almost as much heat to the ground as you lose to the air when you're in extreme cold. I collect about 30 pounds of spruce boughs, the feathery branches, and pack them densely under where I'm going to sit. This isn't optional. This is the difference between survival and freezing to death while you're sitting next to a fire. The first major change from the council fire method was the design itself. Instead of a large open fire, I built what I learned to call a heat capture fire. The stones I'd collected were arranged in a tight circle. The fire would be built in the middle of this circle. The idea is that the stones absorb heat from the flames, and then they radiate that heat back toward you for hours after the active fire has died down. The benefit is enormous compared to the open council fire. A stone that's been heated to 500 degrees will radiate usable warmth for 4 to 6 hours. The council fire's radiant heat was dissipating almost instantly into the wind and the vast cold. I started with the birch bark, crumpled loosely into the center of the stone circle. I lit it with a single match. I carried 2 books of matches, each wrapped in waxed paper, sealed in a small tin. That was my emergency backup. The birch bark caught immediately and burned hot and bright for about 2 minutes, but here's the key. I didn't add the larger pieces of wood to that fire immediately. I waited until the temperature of the fire had already dropped to where it was starting to burn a dull orange rather than bright yellow. This seems counterintuitive. Every instinct tells you to keep feeding a fire. But in extreme cold, a very hot fire attracts wind. The temperature differential creates convection currents that pull the heat away from you. When you let it drop slightly before adding the next layer of wood, you're working with the physics instead of against it. That timing, that wait, probably saved my life that night. It meant the fire burned at a steady, manageable temperature of about 1200 to 1500 degrees, rather than the chaotic 2000-degree spikes that the council fires had been producing. The second major change involved the positioning of the fire relative to my body and the environment. I positioned myself not in front of the fire, but in a triangular arrangement with the fire and a large rock face that was about 30 feet behind me. The rock face was on the north side of the valley. The logic here was that I wanted the fire's heat reaching me directly, and I also wanted that rock face to be reflecting any heat that went past me back toward me. This required moving my position to a specific location. It took me about 45 minutes to find the right spot that first night, using visual lines and just moving incrementally until I found the place where the warmth seemed to accumulate. The angle was crucial. If I sat too close to the fire, I lost peripheral heat. If I sat too far away, the benefit of the radiated heat from the ground stones dropped off dramatically. The distance I settled on was approximately 8 to 10 feet from the fire's center. At that distance, the direct heat on my face was noticeable but not uncomfortable. I could feel warmth on my skin without it being so intense that my face was being dried out. This is important because facial desiccation in extreme cold can lead to frostbite. The third major change was the management of the fire's intensity throughout the night. A council fire, by its nature, requires constant feeding. You're trying to maintain a roaring burn. This method required something completely different. I was feeding the fire in pulses. About every 45 minutes I'd add wood, a specific amount, enough to take the temperature up from maybe 1200 degrees back to about 1500 degrees, but not so much that it spiked above that. Each feeding involved adding 3 to 4 pieces of the medium-sized wood, roughly quarter-inch diameter spruce branches, not more, not less. The heat would build over about 5 to 7 minutes as the new wood ignited and then settled into a steady state. Then I'd wait. During those 45-minute intervals, I was moving minimally. I was staying still, preserving body heat. I was breathing into a piece of cloth I'd made by tearing my undershirt because breathing that cold air directly into your lungs is extremely painful and can cause damage. The cloth warmed the air before it entered my lungs. This is a detail people often ignore, but breathing minus 40-degree air without warming it first can cause internal tissue damage. I learned that from Thomas Bearspaw, and I've never forgotten it. The fourth element addressed the issue of wind management. I built a windbreak using spruce boughs placed in a semicircular arrangement around the back and sides of where I was sitting. This wasn't a solid wall. It was more like a loose collection of branches that reduced wind speed by maybe 30 to 40% without creating turbulence that would actually increase heat loss. Creating too solid of a barrier creates dead air pockets that become stagnant and can actually cool you down through different convection mechanisms. The windbreak I built was roughly 6 feet wide, 4 feet tall, and had maybe 40% open space if you were looking at it from above. This allowed some wind to flow through while dramatically reducing the speed at which it was moving through my immediate area. I spent about an hour building this, and I genuinely believe that windbreak was more valuable than the fire itself. The wind that night was gusting up to 25 miles per hour. Without that break, I would have been losing heat to wind chill at a rate I couldn't have sustained. The fifth element involved layers of insulation under my body and around my core. I'd packed the spruce boughs down into a layer about 8 inches thick under where I was sitting. I also built a second layer of insulation behind my back, using what I could gather. I was wearing layers, wool underneath because cotton was absolutely useless in that climate, a canvas outer layer on top. But I also had a canvas tarp that I'd managed to save when I fell through the ice. I wrapped it around my legs and torso in a way that trapped air but allowed some ventilation so I wouldn't sweat. Sweating in -40 conditions is death. Your body's moisture becomes frozen, and your insulation becomes useless. So the layers had to be breathable while still trapping heat. I also made a rough hat by tying some of the canvas around my head and padding it with more spruce boughs. My ears, my face, my fingers, those are where you lose the most heat in extreme cold. The hat alone probably added 3 to 5 degrees to my core body temperature just from protecting my head. The first test of this method came that night in 1957, and the results were immediate and undeniable. I had 17 days of continuous cold. The first 3 days, the temperature stayed between -38 and -42 degrees Fahrenheit. I maintained that fire using the method I've described: controlled feeding, heat capture stones, the windbreak, the insulation underneath and around my position. By the third day, I realized I wasn't shivering constantly anymore. My body wasn't in the same state of constant crisis. I was cold, absolutely cold, but I was managing it. By day 5, my fire had become routine. I could predict exactly how much wood I'd need. The heat capture stones had become essential. I had what I estimated was probably 40 to 50% of my warmth coming from those stones radiating heat for hours after the active flames had diminished. The comparison to the council fire method was stark. That first night, when I'd built the council fire, I'd gone through almost 80 pounds of wood just trying to maintain what I thought was a survivable situation. With this new method, I was using about 35 to 40 pounds of wood per night, and I was significantly warmer. By the end of 17 days, I'd learned that this method could sustain indefinitely. I had found a sustainable equilibrium between effort and return. I didn't freeze. I didn't run out of resources. I didn't panic. I survived. When I eventually came down from that mountain 17 days later, I was thinner but alive. I'd lost probably 12 to 15 pounds. My face was weather-beaten. My hands had blisters from gathering wood. But I was alive, and I was functional, and I carried that knowledge with me for the next 40 years. I used that method through the 1960s and 1970s. I refined it over time. I tested variations. I built over 300 fires using that methodology in extreme cold, and I refined it through trial and error. The stone selection got better. I learned which types of rock held heat longest and didn't shatter. The windbreak design got more efficient. The feeding schedule got more precise. By the time I was in my 50s, I could build this fire in the dark in a blizzard and have it providing exactly the heat I needed within 30 minutes. The application today is completely practical. If you're winter camping and your gear fails, if you're stranded and need to survive multiple nights in extreme cold, this method works. It works because it's based on physics, not hope. The stones work because specific types of rock have thermal properties that we now understand scientifically. The feeding schedule works because you're managing energy input and output in a sustainable way. The windbreak works because you're reducing heat loss without creating problematic air stagnation. Everything about this method has been verified not just through my 40 years in the wilderness, but through the combined knowledge of the Cree people who had been using variations of this fire for hundreds of years before I ever showed up. Look, I spent 40 years learning these techniques the hardest way possible, alone in the cold, making mistakes that almost cost me my life. My goal with this channel is to give you all that knowledge without you having to go through what I went through. If you want to learn more techniques like this, things that really work when you need them most, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. Leave a like if this video was useful, and tell me in the comments, have you ever been in a situation where this technique would have saved you? And if you want to see another technique that saved me even more times, click on the video that will appear on screen. It's about building a shelter in a whiteout when visibility is less than 3 feet. Remember that this channel presents fictional stories for educational purposes, with production assisted by artificial intelligence. See you next time, and stay safe out there.